I'm going to turn this over to Enterprise's Lori Schumann to get us started. Lori?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Donna, and good afternoon, colleagues. I'm so happy that you can join us today on this very important and timely webinar that we are sponsoring with our partners at the National Center for Healthy Housing and Livable Homes. I just wanted to introduce a little bit about Enterprise and why we're putting this together, and then we're going to move into a presentation. Enterprise Community Partners, of which many of you have worked with us over the years, is a national affordable housing nonprofit that helps to stabilize communities by developing and promoting affordable housing, sustainability, and working with communities on the issues that they're facing around their health and their resilience. I oversee Enterprise's resilience and disaster recovery work around the country, and it has become an emergent need in our communities to have resources and tools to help protect them against the inclement weather and extreme weather events that are happening. Enterprise has 11 offices around the nation, and in each of those offices we work on a variety of issues related to vulnerable communities and affordable housing. So why are we looking at mold today and remediation of mold? We know that so many communities around the nation are facing extreme risks from climate change and extreme weather. In fact, right now as we speak, there are historic storms that are facing many communities in the Southwest and in the Midwest, and we're certainly on watch to make sure that those communities are going to be able to recover in a timely way. I want to reference a very important document and study that was put out this year, which is called the National Climate Assessment. And this assessment looks at what are the risks and the climate risks facing communities around the nation. And it points out in the very first section of the guidance that people who are already vulnerable, including lower income communities, have lower capacity to prepare for and cope with extreme weather and climate-related events. And one of the issues we're seeing come up time and time again around the nation with regards to flooding and precipitation and storm events is the insurgence of mold and the issues that affect community households and homes and buildings around the issues related to recovery. And mold remediation comes up time and time again as a critical issue that we need to resolve and deal with as we recover these homes and these communities after a flood or precipitation event. It's important for you all to understand that the reason why we're so eager to find solutions to climate events and impacts from climate is because we know how vulnerable our affordable housing stock is around the nation. We know that these storms and extreme weather hazards threaten to undermine our affordable housing stock and our communities. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that we can both preserve these homes and facilities and communities from the ravages of extreme weather and ensure that they're sustainable going forward because we do have an incredible and critical affordable housing crisis at hand in this nation. So Enterprise works in many different ways, really in three specific buckets. We like to promote policy that is progressive, that helps our communities rebuild after events and prepare for future risk. And we do that by, for example, working on the Hill. My colleague Marion McFadden was on the Hill last week talking about the need for a permanent authorization of CDBG-DR funding, which is a critical funding tool for communities that are recovering from disasters. We weigh into programs like the National Flood Insurance Program and look closely at how our policies can shape the health and resilience of our communities around the nation. We also work in a second way, which is to work on solutions for our communities, and today's presentation is about a solution-based effort to help provide technical assistance to communities recovering from events, as well as communities that are facing extreme climate risk. And we provide tools and technical assistance and guidance around a variety of issues. I'm happy to talk with many of you after the call if you'd like to reach out and talk about more of that work. And then through our capital work, We provide grants for communities recovering from storm events and other climate hazards. After Harvey, we provided over $1 million of grant funding to communities recovering from the storms, and some of that money actually went into helping communities remediate their housing. And we have loan products that we offer to communities and affordable housing developers to help bridge the gap between getting reimbursed from insurance or FEMA and helping to stabilize housing units. So we work in these different ways across the nation, and we're happy to speak with you afterwards about any needs you might have or technical assistance support. And this is an example of some of the tools we've created over the last couple of years to promote housing resilience, and today's session is going to be looking at a tool that we created after Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. Our colleagues in the Gulf Coast market worked very closely with the National Center for Healthy Housing to promote and create a tool to help communities with mold remediation. So that is a tool that we're going to be focusing on today. And we also have a very extensive set of tools on creating emergency plans for affordable housing facilities as well. And I offer you all the invitation to visit us on the web, and we'll give you the address afterwards. So just before I introduce my good colleague, Jonathan Wilson from the National Center for Healthy Housing, I just wanted to reflect what the impact that mold has on communities, particularly vulnerable households. We've probably all heard in the news and have experienced it ourselves as we operate and maintain and build housing, the extraordinary impact that mold can have on the health of an occupant, particularly occupants that have a compromised immune system, that are elderly, and that are children with a growing immune system. Mold, as we'll find out today, ranges from minor to extreme. The cause of mold and the impact it can have on a household can be absolutely chronic or critical. Mold can be deadly if it's not dealt with in a timely fashion, and it can make the difference. Cleaning up mold after an event like Harvey or the storms that are facing communities today can make the difference between the home being able to be occupable for a year, for 2 years, for decades to come. It's important to deal with mold as quickly as it emerges, or else the entire integrity of the building could be undermined. So this is a very important session. We're really eager to dive in and talk about what to watch out for and how to deal with mold. So without further ado, I'd like to turn over to my colleague, Jonathan Wilson, to take us from here.
Thanks, Lori. My name is Jonathan Wilson. I'm the Deputy Director at the National Center for Healthy Housing. We are a nonprofit organization that works to make sure that there is safe and decent and affordable housing for people across the country. In 2005, I was pulled together with a team of folks that were asked to address the issues that came out of Katrina that hit right before Labor Day in 2005. We've had many storms since then, and in some ways, you know, each one we seem to learn lessons. But for many, Katrina was a point where we learned many lessons about mold cleanup, about floodwaters, and the risks of them. And this webinar is really going to be taking off from work we did at that time. We were asked to go in and assess 4 homes in New Orleans. We went in November of 2005. At the time, if you don't recall, the city had been flooded by a Category 5 hurricane, and shortly after the initial flooding, the levees broke. And New Orleans, which is basically in a bowl, filled up with water. And homes were seeing, you know, some cases, you know, they were lucky to see 2 or 3 feet of water in their home. Others had water up to the ceilings. And a question came up, and if you see this slide and you look at the bottom where the first floor of this building had mold up to the ceiling, the question was, is this inhabitable ever again? Are we just going to have to bulldoze neighborhoods when you see this type of mold can anyone ever safely live in this type of property? And that was the question that was asked of us. Could we actually make these properties safe? So together with Enterprise, with NeighborWorks, and with researchers at Columbia University and Tulane University, we set forth to do a case study looking at 4 homes and seeing what we could do to restore these homes and take measurements to make sure that the mold levels in these homes would be made safe so the people, even with sensitivities like asthma, could live in them again. So we worked with the teams. We tried a number of things, and in the end, we created the document that you see on the screen, Creating a Healthy Home, a flood guide for cleanup, or a guide for a flood cleanup. And out of those, we have a number of lessons that continue to be used, whether it was Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Harvey, the storms in the Caribbean last year. And we've also found that this has been very useful for river flooding, whether it was river flooding shortly after Katrina up in the Northwest or in New York State along the Mississippi. And I'm sure these lessons can be helpful for those who have just gone through the storms in the Midwest over the last month. The lesson that we learned was that, yes, we can restore these homes. We can make them safe for people to live in. We didn't have to knock down all these homes, and they could be a place that people could inhabit and enjoy for many years to come. So for anybody who has gone through a home or anybody who's helping somebody who's gone through flooding recently, there is hope, there's opportunities, and if you do it right and you do it safely, we can create safe places to live and restore the places that have meant so much for, home is not just a shelter. It's a place that people have had a place for comfort, a place for security, but also a place for great memories. And so we want to restore these homes to keep those memories, and we can do that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Armand Magnolia of Livable Housing, who has worked with us closely and done many trainings using this guide to tell people how they can stay safe and make their properties safe and secure for years to come. So with that, I introduce Armand Magnolia.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, this is Armand Magnolia. I'll show my contact information in a moment, but I want to especially thank both Enterprise and the National Center for arranging for sponsoring and holding this presentation. We will be providing you with a download link of the slides for this session, and you'll receive an email with that information and our contact information after the event is completed. So this is my contact information, but you'll receive that later. And I have a question. Donna, I should have asked you earlier, are we able to see a show of hands, a quick count of people?
There is a raise hand button at the lower left of the participant panel. If you happen to see that, okay. Laura just raised her hand. And yep, I'm seeing some hands go up.
Excellent. Now. That's great. Well, okay. All right. Don't get carried away, gang. Wait till I ask the questions.
And click it again to take it down.
All right. So we are curious about folks, and this is by show of hand. If you or clients of yours have experienced these things, let's start with had water above the first floor level. Quick show of hands. Okay, great. How about if you'd clear those, unless your answer is positive to the second one? How many folks have had access to their flooded house, or know of people that have been able to retain access? More people. Okay. How about, is it the general sense for folks that you or your clients have been able to get rid of the damaged flood materials already? See a little quick count of that. Again, a good portion. Okay. And how about folks? How many folks have observed mold as a result of the storms? Okay, a more significant number. Great. This is perhaps a more difficult question, but has it been obvious that there's been sewage present in the floodwater? Not a particularly pleasant topic to discuss, but a very important one as we talk about our recovery efforts and the cleanup. Fewer. Okay. That's great. Adding sewage to the mix really does complicate things. We'll talk about that in detail. And then how many folks are aware of folks that are affected by this that have respiratory problems? Again, a very significant number. Great. Let's ask this specifically. This question is specific to folks doing renovation work themselves. How many folks are either aware of others or are themselves doing their own renovation work? Quite a few. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for helping us get that sense of where people stand in this situation. So here's our agenda. We're gonna focus on health and safety concerns. That's got to be the most important thing to consider. And certainly we're going to be focusing on cleanup and rebuilding strategies. And at the end of the session, we will talk a bit about opportunities to potentially add more resilient, more healthy, more sustainable features as part of the rebuilding process. In some ways, this is an opportunity to be better prepared for the future. And at the end, we'll have a slide on resources. So let's get started. Here's our basic rules regarding cleanup. Number one, worker protection is crucial. Many health risks are avoidable, and we're going to give you good information about that. It helps to understand how mold grows, and so we're going to cover that a bit. And there is a lot of publicity and lots of advertisements about mold cleanup products, but standard cleaning methods tend to work just fine and provide the least amount of risk to the people trying to do cleanup. And then, as we said earlier, sewage is extremely hazardous, and that does require some additional steps and some additional work, including disinfectants. Second slide, this has more to do with the rebuilding side of it. One of the mistakes that we see folks make on, sadly, a regular basis is that they rush through the process in an effort to get back into their homes and don't let the structure dry thoroughly before they begin to close walls back in after having opened them up. Very important. We'll talk some more about that and what are good measures of understanding when it is good to go ahead and finish up your construction. There are some additional chemical treatments in addition to the basic cleaning functions that can be very useful, and we'll talk about those. And this is an opportunity, as I said earlier, to renovate to a healthy and a more sustainable standard. Those are our basic rules. And let's focus for a moment on the points in time when when people could be exposed to health hazards as part of this cleanup process. First of all, when you first go back to inspect is a time when we have to be very careful. We'll talk about what precautions to take. Disturbing anything in an environment where mold is growing really does complicate and expand the risks of mold, and so that's very important that we have to be cautious about moving things around. Certainly during the clean out of the building, there are many risks, health risks to be considered, and sadly a lot of folks in our experience in a number of storms beginning with Katrina, the folks tend to return to their homes because they don't have other options, and they live in the building during cleanup and construction, and there are certainly risks there. During construction and living in the building post-construction, there are also potential risks, and we're going to go through all of these in detail. Some of the hazards we're going to talk about are mold, whether it is active or inactive. There are risks involved. Bacteria, Blackwater. Blackwater is another way of, it's a title, is a term used for stormwater with sewage in it. And then there are standard housing hazards that may have been present previous to the storm, and they can be compounded by flooding and demolition, and those could be electrical hazards, structural hazards, and contaminants. We're going to talk specifically about the contaminants. Some of those include lead paint hazards, asbestos, pests. In terms of lead paint, moisture has the ability of making paint, deteriorating paint dramatically and leaving behind lead paint residue. If it's lead paint, that's very dangerous. It also can expose asbestos risks in flooring and other materials. Pests tend to nest in flooded properties. They're looking for shelter as anyone else would be, and so there's some risks there. Specifically, if in the process of the cleanup you end up doing demolition and exposing nests, in particular birds' nests, they can be very toxic and require strict adherence to personal hygiene and personal protection. Folks, when they are doing cleanup, even when they first go back into the property to do an inspection and observe how much damage is there, really need to pay attention to personal hygiene and personal protection. And there's always the risk of physical injury going through a building after any kind of storm. Structural, electrical, any number of hazards exist that may not have been there before. So in terms of health risks, physical injuries, we're very concerned about them. Structural problems are common in properties that have been in a storm. Open wounds can be a really serious problem. Open wounds exposed to bacteria and contaminants create a very dangerous health situation. So we're very strong on the idea of wearing good protective equipment, having current tetanus shots, and making sure that we clean out cuts and are in a position to give first aid immediately after any kind of injury. Also, electric shocks, big risks with this. We have to make sure that the power's off. And generators, in an effort to provide electricity to do cleanup, often generators create hazards, especially generators that are run indoors to help power pressure washers and other machinery. The other thing that we like to point out, we feel it's very important to point out, is the fact that when you're working on a work site, food and water is easily contaminated, and we're going to talk about methodologies to have a cleanup workstation and a space outside the work area to take breaks and get food and water on them safely with less risk of contamination. So let's talk about some of the effects of mold. Damp homes and mold are associated with asthma development, respiratory infections, asthma exacerbation, also known as asthma attacks. And there's suggestive evidence of association with bronchitis and allergic reactions to the nasal airways. And this is well-known, well-documented scientific data. So we know that being exposed to mold can create all kinds of health issues, and they can be developed over time with exposure. So even if you don't have health risks to start off with, you can develop sensitivities. Some of the symptoms that you may see some upper respiratory tract symptoms: runny nose, watery eyes, sore throat. You may think this is just a cold. It sounds like cold symptoms, but you want to be very cautious and be aware of others that are working alongside of you. Coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath, all of these things can be symptoms for exposure to mold, and we shouldn't assume that they are just work-related and from a common cold. So pay attention to those symptoms. Other risks include lead dust. Lead dust is very difficult to pick out by sight. Impossible, I would say. You won't see immediate symptoms typically, but symptoms can be seen, headaches, things like that. And carbon monoxide, we want to be very careful. I mentioned generators before, but any kind of fuel burning equipment carries carbon monoxide risks with it. Car batteries, propane tanks, all kinds of things can create hazards. So those are things to pay attention to as well. All right, so here's a little quiz. You can take this yourself, answer to yourself at first, and then I'll tell you what the answer is. So the most important factor influencing mold growth is moisture or water. I'm sure you would have guessed that. Molds have the potential to cause health effects such as allergic reactions, true or false? That is true. Not everyone is allergic to mold, but we can develop sensitivities to mold over time. Personal protective equipment, an acronym for it is PPE, is worn in order to limit mold exposure. Minimum PPE for mold remediation, and the word remediation here is important, that's doing the actual work, includes A, a helmet and gloves, B, safety glasses, an N95 respirator and protective shoes, or C, a half-face negative air respirator with a magenta filter, gloves, and goggles. Should be no surprise we go with the most protective option. That's C, and we'll show you what all of this equipment looks like in a bit. Number 4, water damage furnishings and building components should be dried within 24 to 48 hours to prevent mold growth. This is 24 to 48 hours after the event. True or false? That's true. That is a very good guideline to go by. The sooner the better, obviously, but mold can grow very quickly. Number 5, mold cannot be eliminated from indoor environments. Some mold spores will be found floating around through the air and in dust. However, they will not grow if moisture is not present. True or false? And this is true. There are mold spores in every environment that we're in. And so it is more of an issue of having environmental conditions where it can grow more readily and spread and create serious problems. And the health effects of mold exposure. That was the end of the quiz. I hope everyone did well on that. I expect you did fine. Health effects, again, allergic reactions, asthma attacks, effects from the toxins released by molds. Molds actually release toxins as they spread their spores. And the most vulnerable people, as was previously said, are young people, the elderly, people with respiratory problems, those folks that are immune compromised, pregnant women. All the above are the most vulnerable portions of our populations. There are lots of different types of molds. This is Aspergillus, highly magnified. And this one even has its own website. There are some species are much more harmful than others, and yet we don't really recommend taking the time when we have mold present to figure out which kind of mold it is. We think that all molds are generally dangerous, and we should treat them all with caution. Let's spend just a little bit of time on the science behind mold growth, and this is really important because we don't want to make false assumptions about the strategies for dealing with mold, for the potential for growth and the strategies for treatment. So this is from an ASHRAE guide on mold, and so mold spores have enzymes on their surface, and they break down damp organic matter as a food source. So any kind of organic matter can be a food source for mold. And even the dry spores, even a spore that has been dried out because it is in a dry environment, can begin to absorb the food source and, in a sense, rejuvenate itself. So as they begin to grow, they start producing these filaments, hyphae, that grow into the food source. That allows the spores to germinate. The hyphae also have enzymes that dissolve and absorb the food as well. And this all just tends to accelerate the process of mold growth. This is very microscopic, but this is what they're doing. It's a plant of sorts that is rooting on an organic material. And in phase 3 of the process, the hyphae start to grow more thickly. They grow deeply into the surface of the organic material. And they also then begin to form a protective mat that gives them a little protection from the environment. And it also helps to keep the surface moist so that they can continue to feed. And they begin to even generate their own water, which even helps to digest more food. Fascinating creatures. In phase 4, the mold grows spores and releases these spores into the air. And when the food source runs out or when the moisture goes away, mold growth slows or stops, but the spores are their way of reproducing. And then that just begins the process over again. Hope that's helpful. There are a couple other things to keep in mind. There's some technical terms here. Mycelium is the mass of mold. Mold spores can remain dormant for long periods of time until growing conditions are favorable. There are fragments of mold, including the hyphae, can also be transplanted to grow new colonies. And it's the moisture on the surface of the food source that really gets things started. And what's another thing that's interesting here is that dirt is even a food source. So even if a surface material is not organic, there could be dirt on it that would be sufficient as a food source for mold to grow. So, Jonathan. Jonathan Wilson's going to take over and talk a little bit about his some experience in New Orleans post Katrina, and this is particularly important because it'll give you very good information about the risks of mold exposure during the cleanout process.
Thanks, Armand. I think that we have a benefit with mold in that there is a huge ew factor. I think that's important, that when, some of the contaminants we deal with, we can't smell them, we can't see them. Something like radon, we tend to ignore it as a risk. When you go into a home that's been flooded and you see mold growing up the wall and you can smell it, I think that there is a general sense that there's something wrong going on here, and we need to be really cautious. And that is a good thing. That's really important for us to make sure that people are recognizing that they have to wear that protective gear that Armand was talking about, and we'll talk about a little bit further about what you should be doing and keeping yourself safe. But even with that ooh factor, we sometimes overlook how serious this can be, and we'll say, oh, I can just run in for a couple minutes and I'll be fine. I don't need to put on this mask, or I don't need to put on this suit that's warm or hot, that I can do this safely, and it's not a big deal. And so I just want to point out some lessons we learned. Again, as I was mentioning, that we went down and we had university partners who had mold collection gear to be able to test the air in a couple of homes we were working in New Orleans. And so we were working, in this case, in 2 homes were in the Centennial neighborhood. One was a little bit higher off the ground, so it didn't have as much flooding. The other had flooding basically up to the first floor ceiling. So go ahead, Armand, and let's see the pictures of these 2 homes. So the first is a 2-story home. It was built relatively new. It was only about 20 years old when Katrina hit. Slab-on-grade construction, and this was the one that was raised a little bit. So it had about 2 to 3 feet of mold growth on the first floor. It had only about a foot of water on that first floor that generated that 2 to 3 feet of mold. The second home was in a lower part of the neighborhood. 1-story home. It was older, built on piers, and it had at least 5 feet of flooding, and the mold growth, when we got into this property, was all over the ceiling. It was all over everything. It was a place that you had to have full protective gear just to feel like you could breathe safely in this property. So what did our mold sampling results tell us? So if our part of the brain that has the ooh factor is telling us this is a problem, looking at these results, really set forth. So what do we know about colony-forming units? Number one, nobody has created a health standard for this. So you can't go to the CDC or the World Health Organization and find out what is a safe level of mold that I should be in. That has not been created. But we have some averages. So the average for an interior property is less than 1,000 colony-forming units per cubic meter. On the outside, in a community like New Orleans that tends to be humid, tends to have a lot of vegetative growth around there, it tends to be in the 5,000 to 10,000 range on the outside during the warm, humid season. So that's giving you a baseline on what people are normally exposed to. So here we have a living room where you'd normally expect it to be less than 1,000, and we're over 1 million colony-forming units during the possession removal process when we're pulling stuff out of the property. After we've allowed it to settle down and people haven't been in that property, it's dropped down to 35,000, but it's still way above what we normally expect. And then when we were doing demolition, so we've gotten all those possessions that have been sopped with water, have mold all over the unit. They're out of there, but we still have mold on plaster, on some places where we had drywall, and on the wood studs behind the walls are still coated with mold. And during that process of pulling out the broken plaster, the lath, and cleaning up, we're at almost 600,000. And even in this property, and this is the good property, this is the property that only had 2 to 3 feet of mold on the walls. And even on the second floor, where there is no water, we're seeing levels that are well above what you'd normally be exposed to on a normal day. Looking at that second house, this is the one that had mold up to the ceiling. You know, when nobody's been in it, and again, that there's been no disturbance, we're seeing levels that are well above. The first time when it's been closed up, it's higher. When we've been able to open up the windows and allow for a little bit of movement, it's a little bit drier in there. We're seeing lower levels, but levels that are still well above 10,000 on the inside. And then it jumps off the roof when we start doing demolition. Well over 6 million colony-forming units per cubic meter in that living area. And this is where, you know, while we're pulling stuff out to the street, and we'd be expecting to see maybe 10, 15,000 on the outside of the property, while we're doing this, moving all this debris to the outside and creating piles, and there's piles at the neighboring houses, we're seeing over 30,000 colony-forming units just on the outside of the property where you'd think it would be relatively safe. So we're creating an unsafe space inside the house that's magnitudes above where we'd expect it to be. And even on the outside, we've got real problems. So when you're doing this, you need to be wearing your protective gear. It's clearly on the inside, but also on the outside, because we may be creating a real hazard, both interior and exterior. So hopefully, you know, this will get in beyond that ew factor, that there's numbers behind it to say we need to be really safe when we're we need to be wearing our protective gear when we're doing this work. Armand?
Yes, Jonathan, that's excellent. The 6 million number to me is just fascinating. I think it's accurate to say, Jonathan, that was the threshold of the equipment, that it was, you may have said this and I missed it, but it could well be have been above 6 million because the equipment couldn't measure past that point.
Right. There's capacity.
And yeah. So amazing, just amazing. And just to reiterate, boy, that as soon as we start moving things around, the risks increase. So let's talk a little bit about the concepts of personal hygiene here. It's really important to be able to wash your hands when you take breaks. You want to make sure you have clean break areas. Protective clothing can spread all of the bad stuff that you run into in a home that's been flooded, in a home that has mold growth or other contaminants. And so a lot of people will not pay sufficient attention to that. This is a graphic of a cleanup station that we like to suggest you set up before you do any work at all, and we'll talk more about this. But the idea of making sure that you have a place, a pre-planned place to go to clean up, get a drink of water, take a quick break, it's very important. I'm going to now go through and talk a bit about the information out of the field guide that the National Center created, and there will be, you can easily find that on the National Center's website, and it will have links also in the resources end of this presentation that you'll be able to get via download. So there is a disclaimer, and we certainly want to thank Home Depot and Robert Woods Johnson's Foundation for funding this, and there were a number of other people involved in this process, and this is giving them credit. And just a mention to the disclaimer that's in this. Another thing that we want to mention is that it's our recommendation that mold remediation professionals do mold cleanup in serious jobs. We also understand that sometimes that's just not possible. After a storm, it is difficult to find mold professionals, but if you have that option, we really want you to seriously consider it because they've been trained to do this. If you're going to hire mold remediation professionals, you should know your state regulations. It's difficult for us to talk about these on a webinar because we have people from so many different states. But it is worth a quick analysis of what is required in your state for licensing and regulatory requirements for contractors. We really do not like the idea of fogging or wholesale spraying. There are contractors that do that kind of work and live by that kind of work, and we think that is really not the best methodology at all. We highly recommend against fogging. If you're going to hire a professional, it's ideal to get more than one quote. Again, we know that's not always possible, but if you can, it's worth the time if it's an option. Get references regardless, and check references. Sadly, after storms, there are people out there looking for work that may have good intentions or may not, but are not qualified. So checking references is important. We also really like the idea of having a third-party inspector take a look at a property after cleanup and provide clearance testing. In some states, it's legislated that person has to be independent from the mold remediation contractor. Regardless, you want written reports of any inspection findings because you want to be able to document that your house was in good shape at the end of the process, and you should always hold on to that report for future use. There are 2 agencies that do certify mold professionals, and again, this will be on the slide, on the PDF file of the slides so you can get access to these websites and the names of these agencies later. There are other professionals that you may need if there's asbestos in the property. Again, an incredibly high-risk contaminant. And in some states, there are contractors who apply borate solutions. That if some states you need to be a licensed pest control operator to apply some of the solutions we're going to talk about, even some of the more benign ones, but we'll talk more about them in a bit. And when it comes to worker and occupant safety, we're harping on this, but it's crucial. People with asthma, mold allergies, or other respiratory conditions, people with weakened immune systems, children and pregnant women should not do this kind of work and really should be out of these homes until work is complete. So, word of caution. We definitely want folks to wear a respirator. There are many folks that believe that the paper respirators, like the one pictured at the top with the elastic straps, they're called N95 or N100 respirators, are sufficient for work. We believe that they are sufficient for 15-minute exposures if you are not disturbing any materials that could spread mold spores. For work, either the half-face negative air respirator with a magenta filter, which is a plastic shrouded filter typically with like a neoprene rubber body to it, and separate filter canisters that are replaceable is a much better choice. Or one of these fancy powered air purifying respirators which actually duct filtered air into a hood. Very comfortable to use, and for folks that have beards, the powered air purifying respirator is a must-have. So respirator use is extremely important, and we'll reiterate that again. But everybody's respiratory system is not up to the task of doing this kind of work, or for even wearing a respirator. If you know you have respiratory issues, you should maybe get your doctor to tell you that it's okay. And it is really best to have a respirator fitted to you to make sure that it is going to do its job properly. OSHA regulations require that for contractors, and it is good guidance for anyone doing this kind of work. Eye protection, there are, with all the contaminants that are out there and the other hazards, safety glasses or a full face shield is really an excellent idea. Wearing a hat with a brim can help keep things out of your eyes. Your cleanup station that is safe and away from the work area should have eye wash available along with other first aid materials. Earplugs are quite useful, especially if heavy equipment's being used, and we really strongly recommend heavy work boots. If you're going to be working in a construction demolition environment, there are so many hazards. Sneakers, tennis shoes are not sufficient. Heavy work boots are much better. We really like using coveralls. I believe we have illustrations of the types of coveralls we would recommend coming up, and we'll show you those. We like the coveralls that have an integral hood and feet on the coveralls. They're typically made of a Tyvek material, and that they are excellent, and they are disposable. So cleaning up is much, much easier using any of those disposable coveralls. Cut-resistant, waterproof gloves are really excellent. And remember, wash your hands and face before eating, drinking, smoking. Any kind of ingesting of things carries with it the risk of ingesting contaminants. Excuse me. Just talking about contaminants makes me cough. And of course, everything that you wear that is cleanable, that's reusable, needs to be cleaned after use. But disposable equipment is excellent. So now we're going to talk about work strategies at different stages. This is all in the flood cleanup guide. Really like this order of things and this ability to look at things chronologically. Very important, this just making reference to the different pages in the guide where material exists. And so let's just go ahead and walk through this. We're going to talk about the pre-work inspections, setting up things to do before work begins, site preparation before you go in and actually start doing work, the clean-out phase, gutting, tearing out procedures, pre-construction cleaning and treatment, which is crucial. We want to make sure that we get things cleaned and treated appropriately to get rid of contaminants. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to make decisions about what to tear out, what to prep before restoration. And we will also talk a bit about restoring possessions. You'll notice this is fairly front-end loaded. There is a bunch of work before you even get to the clean-out phase, and that's intentional. So number one, pre-work inspections. Obviously, you want to check for and document hazards that you may see. There's any kind of service, electrical, gas, water needs to be shut down typically before work starts. You want to be looking for structural issues. You want to itemize and document where the water damage is, where there's mold growing that's visible, and any potential lead paint or asbestos risks. Start thinking about things that you think you can save and detailing them, or maybe architectural details that are worth saving, might be materials that are salvageable. Some wood details can be, typically drywall, and fibrous materials are not. Are there personal belongings that you may be able to save? In any case, this is all part of the pre-work inspection, starting to document and categorize things that you're going to try to save or dispose of. And before work begins, you want to make sure you've got supplies and you've got a plan ahead for trash removal. Oftentimes, debris can be stored at the curb. We recommend putting signage up to let people know that there's hazards there. The last thing we want is for debris at the curb to be a hazard for children in the neighborhood. You want to set up a separate storage area for items that you're going to save. You want to get them out of the work area. We don't want them to become any more contaminated. If you need temporary electricity, you need to set that up at this stage. If you're going to have tools on site, you may want to set up secure storage for them. Certainly turn off, as I said, gas and electric services if there's still risks. And then, of course, there's the issue of bathroom access. If you don't think of that at first, at some point that'll occur to you. But these are all things to think about ahead of time. You don't want to start work without having thought about them. We're going to talk here for a minute about basements. In Katrina, there were no basements to deal with. Certainly post-Sandy, we dealt with many basements in New Jersey and New York, and so it's a mix of situations. But basements present some very unique issues and risks. And Blackwater, I mentioned before, is water that's contaminated with sewage or has begun to support some sort of bacterial growth. And this stuff often collects in basements. Professionals will call this Category 3 water. The higher the category number, the higher the risk. This is the highest category risk. And so when we're dealing with Blackwater, and especially water in basements, you're going to need waders of some sort and respiratory protection. You don't want to be wading in this water and allowing the water to get to your skin. Pumping out basements is sometimes necessary, and the gas that's in Blackwater, the sewage that's in Blackwater, produces a methane gas, which is an extreme hazard. So we wanted to get the water out. We have to be very careful when we're doing that, and eventually when we get the water level down, then there'll going to be solid debris remaining that we're going to need to shovel out. Blackwater in basements, we're going to talk in more detail about cleanup, but in basements this involves scrubbing down walls, and if you have working floor drains, that's great. You may not. And this is a soap and water process at first, and we'll talk more about other treatments. Laundry or dishwashing detergent actually works great, and mild bleach solutions can be an option here as well. But bleach we don't wholesale recommend bleach because it is not as effective as some people give it credit for, and it also presents other hazards and damages materials. Soap and water is an excellent cleaning medium, and that's what we recommend. Another risk with basements is that ventilation is crucial. We mentioned methane before. Having windows and doors open to the basement and having fans on to exhaust whatever gases are in there is really important. There are sadly no air purifying respirators that protect against sewer gas exposure, so you have to be very careful and you need a supply of fresh air, and there may be insufficient oxygen. So there is a risk in a basement if you don't have enough ventilation that you could pass out. This would be a terrible thing, especially if you're working alone. So we always really strongly recommend that this is not a task for an individual to take on. You need multiple people on site, some of which are just watching out for the person that's in the basement. Serious risks here to be dealt with. Another risk with water in basements is the standing water that is in the basement. Normally, the water table in the ground surrounding a house sits below the foundation level. In this illustration, you see water coming off the roof. On the left side of this illustration, it is saturating the water table, raising the water table in the ground, and creating a potential moisture problem in the basement on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, this is depicting a little better stormwater management plan with water going off the roof onto a gutter and downspout and away from the building. And, you know, typically in rain situations, having good stormwater management minimizes the saturation level of the ground and doesn't really affect the water table. But in a flooded situation where the water level has gone perhaps risen partway up the basement or even past the basement into the first floor, the water table could be saturated all around the building, and removing basement flood water too quickly can create an amazing hazard in that the pressure of the water in the water table can actually push in the basement foundation walls. So FEMA has excellent recommendations about this. We need to be very cautious about and strategic about removing water out of basements. And FEMA's recommendations say when flood waters have receded as such that they're no longer covering the ground outside, pump 1 foot of water out of the basement, mark where the water level is, and wait overnight. And then check the water level the next day. If the water level went back up, it means that the water table is still very high and water is still seeping into the basement, and it's too early to completely drain the basement. Next, if you've done that and the water level has gone back up, wait 24 hours, pump the water down a foot again, and then check and repeat that until the water in the basement stops returning to your mark. And at that point, pump out 2 or 3 feet and wait overnight and see what happens. And just follow that protocol. Be very cautious about trying to pump all the water out of the basement at once, because the last thing you want is to have basement walls collapse or create structural problems that are just going to make the repair very, very expensive, if possible at all. And we talk about this at this stage because we need you to be thinking about removal of standing water in the basement as you're strategizing about the rest of the work that you're trying to do. And you will be able to do some, possibly do some clean out before completely pumping out the basement if the building is structurally okay. There is a website where FEMA goes into great detail about this, and again, you'll have this in your copy of the slides. All right, so now let's get back to the process. Site preparation, which involves setting up a safety and cleanup area and also personal protective equipment. So one of the things that we strongly believe in is this idea of separating the work areas, the areas that have been affected by the flooding, and those that have not been. So for instance, if the basement was flooded but the first floor wasn't, having clear separation between those areas is important. And as it might be if the first floor was flooded and there's a second floor, again, you would want to try to seal off the second floor from the first floor to minimize the spread of contaminants from first floor to second floor. And there are things like, you can create plastic sheeted doorway coverings. In this case, there's a sheet of plastic with a slit and then a flap over top of it to protect the opening, so that as you go from clean areas to work areas, you're spreading fewer contaminants. We always say set up a things to be saved table outside the work area or an area to save things, and consider putting plywood down or some kind of sheet material to walk on to remove things. If you're removing furniture and cabinetry and upholstered stuff out of the building, going over soggy carpeting can be very hazardous. Think about the surfaces you're walking on. We also want you to think very much about ventilation. As you're doing this, it's always important to try to dry out the building immediately. But again, we don't want to create a ventilation strategy that spreads contaminants from the work area into areas that weren't heavily affected. So again, sealing off those areas and making sure that you are ventilating the work area in a way that it's not contaminating others. Here's a strategy where the first floor was affected, so there's a window fan ventilating the first floor. You might think putting a fan up on the second floor would make sense, but no, we would strongly recommend sealing off the connection between the floors and ventilating directly from the work area. So during the clean out, we're going to ventilate. Now we're at the clean out stage. We're actually starting to work. We want to ventilate as much as we can. We want to remove small furniture and objects on the floor first, create pathways that are clear, then move on to large furniture, removing large furniture. Appliances would follow that, refrigerators, stoves that have been affected. Cut and remove wall-to-wall carpeting, cut it into manageable sections rather than trying to drag out a big section. Cut strips, roll it up in strips, bag it, take it out, move it to the curb. Clean out all your closets, shelves, storage areas, kitchen cabinets. We need to get into every nook and cranny in the work area to make sure that we have exposed all the potential areas where mold could be growing, where contaminants may have spread. It's very important to be methodical here, and going in this pattern of starting with small stuff, large stuff, appliances, flooring is the safest way to go. There are some historic details you may want to save that may be higher quality. Saving those is good. Again, if you can get them out at this stage and store them someplace safe, that would be great. But it's often much less expensive to dispose of building components that are moldy. And certainly any drywall, plaster materials, carpeting that's become moldy, that stuff needs to go. There is a section about selective tear out in this clean out guide called Section 7, which is worth taking a look at. But this is, if we're gutting and tearing out materials, we want to be thinking about what can we save and what do we need to store and what is just going to be debris. Any cabinets, shelves, doors, trim that has been damaged beyond repair, this is the time to remove them during the process, and then tearing down drywall or plaster ceilings that have been affected, removing drywall and plaster from the walls would be the next steps in the process. You'll notice that we have the ceilings first before the walls. The idea here is we're working from the top down, and you'll notice in this illustration, this person is working from a ladder. It's very important, if you're on a ladder, not to be pulling materials onto you. So this is a stage when you're first getting started. It's difficult to do, but you need to be cautious that you're not going to pull a ceiling down on top of you as you go. So you'll see they've started cleaning out an area, and now they're using pry bars or tools to lever off other materials. And it's extremely important to, if you're going to create debris from a process like this, create a pile, move it out, and then move on. Do not do the entire ceiling in a room and then try to remove the debris. It's way too dangerous. Work in stages. That also gives you a little break to be outside. Any insulation that was affected, any layers of the floor that were affected, certainly all dirt and debris needs to be removed at this gut tear out stage. So let's say we are now at the stage where we've cleaned out all the materials that have been affected. I will say at this point there are some folks that suggest that you can get away at times by removing only the bottom 4 feet of a wall covering. That may or may not be true. We have seen plenty of situations where people have done that, left the upper portion of the wall intact, and had mold grow inside that wall cavity above there. You'll see in this illustration the entire wall has been gutted. It does make it a lot easier to clean, and it is a better way of ensuring that you're addressing all the potential mold growth and contamination. It's something to consider. I think sometimes it's penny wise and pound foolish to go part way up the wall, although some insurance companies will suggest that. I don't think it's that much more expensive to do the whole wall. In any case, when we're done gutting, then we want to go to this phase where we're doing pre-construction and cleaning, and this phase is very important because this is where we have our work will help to ensure that we're not creating an unhealthy situation in the long term. So when we say prepare all surfaces, we mean get it as clean as possible, pull nails, get rid of as much debris as possible so it's possible to do a good job of cleaning. At this stage, we would recommend vacuuming all surfaces so that we get any dried debris out. Using a HEPA vacuum would be ideal here. HEPA vacuums filter out the worst of the contaminants. It may be difficult to find one, but if you can find one, they are superior. And take the time at this stage to vacuum everything. Then we say wet clean, wooden surfaces, disinfect hard surfaces. Hard surfaces would be things like porcelain tubs, sinks, countertops that are going to stay, that are waterproof. Any hard surface like that can be disinfected at this stage, but soap and water on the wooden surface is important. We're going to talk about treatments with borate solutions, and then we'll talk more about that in a moment. But then at that point, we really want to dry out the building as best we can. And that means getting the moisture content of the wood down below 15%. There are moisture meters that measure this, and it would be great to have one. After we've dried out the building, we may consider treating with fungicidal coatings, but they do carry some risks with them. We're going to talk about that in more detail. We don't want to apply any kind of coating to this stage to any of the materials, especially the exposed wood materials that are what we call impermeable. Impermeable means they don't let moisture transfer through. Perm ratings are a measure of how permeable a material is. The higher the number, the more permeable, the better able that material is to dry. And so we don't want to apply any coatings that don't allow moisture out. So you must picture coatings here that do allow some evaporation off the materials if they get wet again. This is very important. There are some cleanup materials that are impermeable, and then if those structural materials get wet again, they're never able to dry out properly. Sometimes during this pre-construction cleaning and treatment time, we may need to run dehumidifiers in hot, humid climates. Commercial dehumidifiers and other restoration industry equipment can speed this up. There are commercial dehumidifiers like the ones pictured at the top of this slide. There are also air scrubbers that are used to help create more circulation of air. If commercial equipment is not an option, Louisiana State University, who has great resources about this, recommends combining running of air conditioning and electric heat at the same time to help dehumidify and clear out the air. Their website has some great detail about this methodology. We're going to give you a resource connection to that as well. This is an illustration of a moisture meter, and we think these are really important to use to make sure that we get all the wooden materials that are exposed after a flood dry to that less than 15% moisture content before we re-drywall, before we close in these walls. These don't have to be terribly expensive things, but as you can imagine, if you close in a wall prematurely, you can create all kinds of problems with mold growth behind the new clean, shiny drywall finish. A word about HEPA vacuums. They could be expensive. You could try to rent a HEPA vacuum for the vacuuming portion of the cleanup process. There are some of the shop vac style wet dry vacs have accessory HEPA filters. They're not truly HEPA filters, but that might be some sort of compromise. So in any case, being cautious about this is very important. Let's talk about wet cleaning. Again, we don't really recommend bleach except for hard surfaces, as I mentioned before. A non-phosphate detergent, the Center for Disease Control recommends using laundry detergent or dishwashing detergent. And this 1 cup of household bleach per 1 gallon of water is important to remember for those hard surfaces. You don't need anything stronger than that. You should not use straight household bleach. And household bleach is sufficient. You don't need to have a concentration greater than 1 cup of household bleach with a gallon of water. If you're mopping and cleaning, we strongly suggest using a multiple bucket system where you have a constant clean rinse water bucket to rinse out your mop and then wring it out before you use it again. So having separate buckets for soapy water, clean rinse water that you change regularly, and then a third bucket with a wringer to wring out the mop is the best way to go. If you don't have the 3-bucket system, you just end up spreading contaminated water around. That's not what you want to do. So the idea is use soapy water on the mop, mop up an area, rinse it out in clean water, wring it out in the wringer bucket, and then go back to the soapy water and mop again. And that means that you have to change the water in the rinse bucket very regularly. Very important methodology. I think, Jonathan, you're up.
I am. Actually, if you go back to the last slide, I'd love to say a couple more words about that.
Oh, but yeah, absolutely. If I can hit the right button.
Yeah, there you go.
I think I did it before.
That's why
you started,
you're the expert here.
Well, you are the expert, dude. So I think I did a great job of anticipating your slides last time. Let's see if I can repeat that during this section.
Okay. So I think that this is probably one of the most important slides in the whole deck, and I just want to emphasize a couple of points. Beyond the fact that you need to protect yourself, these steps are so critical, and you have to just remember, it should be the mantra: clean, disinfect, dry. And if you can take those steps, there's some extra things you can do, but if you're doing those 3 steps well, then you're not going to get the mold returning, and you're going to have a safe place to live for a long time. And why is it important that we think about it as 3 distinct steps? You want to be, for our disinfection to work, and that is generally bleach, but it could be other products that can be successful in disinfection. Many of those disinfectants do not work on a dirty surface. We often think about OxyClean or something like that. These are oxidizers that are disinfecting because they are getting to the virus or the mold spore or whatever we want to kill, and it basically blows it up with oxygen. And if that chemical or material hits something before it gets to the thing you want to get rid of, it's going to burn itself out. And so if it hits some dirty organics, if it hits some grease that's there, it hits some bacteria that's there that's okay, then it's going to burn itself out, and it's not going to get deep into the wood to kill the mold, to kill some of the other materials that are in there. And so you have to clean first. And the other reason why it's really important to do that is if you choose to use bleach, we've been emphasizing that if you mix bleach with ammonia or bleach with ammonia products that you may not even think are ammonia, you can create a very dangerous gas. And many people each year are sent to the emergency department, and sometimes worse, because they have been in a condition where they've mixed bleach and ammonia and gotten very sick. And so we want to make sure that we are keeping the step of cleaning separate from the step of disinfection. And it's very effective to do the cleaning step first, as Armand said, using that 3-bucket system. And we use it not only for mop cleaning, but for sponge cleaning as well, having that 3-step system so that you're not reintroducing those contaminants onto that surface. Because in the end of the day, if you're just putting that sponge into the same water, you're not cleaning. You're just threading around whatever you're trying to get rid of. So those are really important steps. And then the final step is after you've gotten that surface wet again, you want to make sure that you're leaving plenty of time and using any mechanical methods to dry it before you close it up. Because if you've left any mold spores within your wall or within any surface that you're closing up and it's still damp when you close it up, that's going to be a perfect site for that mold to regrow. And Armand showed you those earlier slides of how the mold cycle allows itself to go dormant, and then with a little bit of moisture, a little bit of warmth, it'll regrow. And that's a problem. If it's starting to grow inside your walls, you'll start to smell it. You'll start to have the allergens from it. So with that, those are those really key steps. When we want to talk about the chemicals we're using in our homes, we need to recognize that many of them, especially the disinfectants that we're using, are regulated chemicals, and they're regulated under EPA. That's meant to protect us from many bad things in our environment. So recognize that this is both something to look out for, but also something that you can be protective. Somebody may be selling you something that says, oh, this will take care of your mold. Well, if they're selling it to you as a cleaner, it's not going to be covered by EPA, but if it's being sold to you as a disinfectant, then you should be able to see on that there's a label that says that it's EPA certified as a disinfectant. And that is, it's important to be able to look for that. in addition, you want to make sure that you are reading the safety data sheets that are required whenever there's a regulated chemical, so that you know, what are you using. Again, being careful that if it does have any bleach in it, that you're using it not mixing it with something else. There may be other chemicals there that's useful to see. What are the reactions that may come from it? We've already been discouraging people that have respiratory issues to try to do this work, but especially if you see that these are a chemical that has a high respiratory toxic level, that you want to be especially careful about those chemicals. There are chemicals that are alternatives to bleach, and I have to say that in doing this work, that's probably the thing that I've gotten the most reactions about. There are people out there that say that bleach is the holy water, that you don't take away my bleach. You go into communities and say you should be using something else, and they'll say there's no way you're going to take that out of my hands. And then there are others who feel just as passionately that bleach, because of the risk of mixing it with other chemicals, because of risks, because it may be an irritant to people, it may cause chemical burns for certain people. It may be a factor in that it is corrosive, and so if you use it on certain materials, it may be bad for those materials, especially metals. And so there are many people that want you to shy away from using bleach. And so there are definitely other chemicals out there. Quaternary ammonium compounds, also known as quats, are in certain products, and you can see that on the material data sheet, what's in them, and they are disinfectants that have been used for mold cleanup. They have been shown to be effective, and so you don't need to use bleach. The FEMA actually has a document out there recommending these, as well as pine oils, phenols, as effective, useful alternatives to using bleach if you're trying to get away from that product. And here's one example. We're not endorsing it, but it is something that is sold at big box stores, and because of the name, people gravitate to it and say, hey, I've heard that bleach isn't good, so maybe I should use this. And certainly this is a product that meets that criteria. It is has quats in it. It will be effective as the second stage, as that disinfectant stage, and it will kill the compounds or at least be a biocide for the mold that's on the surface. We want to use this not only to address the mold, but in homes that are in flood zones, there have been many things that are in that water. We've talked about sewage, but you also, if you're in a farm community, there may be runoff from farms that hold many things that you don't want to have in your home, many different types of bacteria. If you're in an industrial community, there may be certain chemicals that you want to make sure that, one, in that cleaning step, you're cleaning well, and if there's any chemicals that have biologicals in them, you want to make sure that you're killing those. So cleaning properly and disinfecting are really important separate stages that you want to be going through. And Moldex is one example of an alternative to bleach that's important for that disinfection stage.
I think the hazard statement there is noteworthy. It's an example of the hazard statement you'd see on a safety data sheet, and it means be careful.
And once you get past that clean and disinfect stage, then there are some optional extra things that we think can be useful. And this step is, I think, is definitely something we put on the higher priority as an option that you should think about. So once you've cleaned and disinfected, then there is still a risk, as we said, is that if it's not totally dry when you close up the wall, that things could come back, the mold spores could come back. And so borates are a chemical that can soak into wood and have a biocidal property that will deter not only mold from regrowing, but it actually deters termites from eating that product. If it's there's a little bit left on the ground when you spray it onto your wood studs, you actually may deter cockroaches that may be running around within your wall space. So borates have a biocidal nature that is good to prevent many bad things from coming back in your house. So you know, there are many products out there. There are some that are in powder form. We're showing this now, the Timbor. There are some that are in a liquid form called like Boracare that have a glycol in it that helps it absorb into the wood. And then there's some that not only have the borates in them, but actually have also some quats in them. So it's not only being a preventive measure, but actually can be an extra mold killer at the same time. So there's an expense when you go from the powder to the liquid-based glycol, a little bit more expensive, and then if you add the mold care into it, that adds some more costs. So if you've already done a good job of cleaning and disinfecting, the powder is probably good enough. If you want to go to an extra step, if you're in a room that you know gets flooded regularly, you might want to go to a higher level to have that absorption be higher. And so that's an example of products you can add after you've done the cleaning and disinfecting. And you can see how this is done. You mix it with the powder and water. You spray it onto your studs, onto any cavity that you're going to close up, and then you let it dry, and it becomes a preventive measure for the future. And, again, we don't want to emphasize this too much, but this is just some details about where you can get this information and look at, and as I mentioned, there are different levels that are open to people. So to emphasize, clean, then dry, make sure it's down to a level that's appropriate, and then apply these surfaces, these products that will be beneficial for prevention in the long run, and make sure you're following the instructions. The EPA is regulated and it's for a reason. People have used these inappropriately. Follow the instructions. That's part of the regulation process to make sure that the instructions are clear and that you're doing it appropriately. And you don't want to, it is not a product where you say, oh, if I double the amount that I'm putting on, it's going to be better. It may actually not work as well. So you want to use the allowance that is put into the instructions. And ultimately, cleaning and drying are the most important. This is an extra step, extra protection at a minimal cost. One other thing that some people talk about is using a coating. We don't encourage people to use this except, one, if you have somebody in your house that is highly sensitive to mold, and two, if you've got a room or an area that is likely to be flooded a lot, and in that case, then you want to have this extra protection. And this is one example of a product. We're not endorsing it, but it is a product that is a sealant, and it does have that perm rating that Armand was talking about that does allow vapors to move through, so that if you haven't totally dried that surface, then it will allow some of that moisture to get out, and you will avoid wood rot of those studs that you've now covered. But for the most part, you can avoid using this, and then you don't have to worry about sealing up too soon and having a product that is rotting. So I think that's the product chemical portion of this. I'm going to turn it back to Armand to bring us home.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great job. I like the fact that the borate powders can be mixed in a typical pump sprayer that most folks have around and can be applied. I think that there's so many benefits to being able to apply those borates, and extra level of protection has quite a bit of value, and I like the fact that it's a pretty straightforward application. So let's talk a bit about selective tear out, and prep pre-restoration. So we've got the place all cleaned out now. One thing that people sometimes neglect is opening up the enclosed spaces like attics and crawl spaces as much as they can to allow those areas to dry out. Very important to keep in mind. You know, certainly we've talked about the list of things that you may want to consider for removal. Ceramic floors sometimes can manage quite well through a flood. It depends more on what the substrate is under the ceramic floor than the floor itself. The covering of the floor in ceramic tile may be over top of a wood subfloor that it has been damaged by the flooding. So that's something to think about. Wood windows, doors, and trim, they can be repaired and restored in some cases. Tongue and groove flooring, like 3/4-inch oak flooring, it really depends on how wet it got, how quickly you were able to dry things out. Sometimes they warp badly beyond the point of repair. So there's, you know, so you're going to have to use your best judgment with all of these things to decide what is repairable, what is worth removing. With HVAC equipment, we have, with heating, cooling, air conditioning equipment, we have other things to consider, especially with ductwork. If ductwork has been underwater, oftentimes the best thing to do is to remove it. Possessions, sometimes wood furnishing, wood tables and chairs might be repairable. Clothing, drapery, and other cloth, it's depends thing. It depends on how quickly you can get in, get things cleaned, get things out, and get them cleaned. Things that are washable, like china, glass, jewelry, porcelain, metal, if they haven't been severely corroded by contaminants, they may be cleanable. Electric appliances are tough. If they've been under flood water, they are rarely worth keeping. It doesn't make sense typically to hold on to those knickknacks, valuables. You'll have to decide what's keepable and what isn't. Generally, it has to do with the construction of the material and whether or not it has absorbed contaminants or whether or not you are able to clean it. We would like to talk now a little bit about this idea of rebuilding with resiliency and sustainability in mind. Resiliency, of course, being that a feature, a classification of materials or an ability for a material to withstand things like flooding or other events and come back and still be usable. So longer life, things that have longer life cycles, things that are resistant to moisture damage, things that contain fewer contaminants to start with, that are things that are easily cleanable and require less maintenance. We have the opportunity to make choices for components that we're replacing that fit these descriptors better than what you may have had previously. Something to consider, certainly. So other things to consider, you may have opened up exterior walls that hadn't previously been insulated. Now may be an opportunity to add insulation, which might be very useful. We'll talk a little more specifically about that. I'm going to talk about air sealing, a very good thing to do from all kinds of reasons. Certainly we recommend the use of products that have low levels of VOCs, that's volatile organic compounds. Some paints, some floor coverings, some cabinetry have high VOC levels. We know we want to avoid formaldehyde in products as much as we can, but this is an opportunity to think about the VOC levels in products. It's an opportunity to increase ventilation, especially ventilation in bathrooms and kitchens. which can have a big impact on health, but also possibly whole house ventilation. And then there's also the opportunity to upgrade equipment, HVAC systems, hot water, domestic hot water systems. If they are damaged or destroyed, oftentimes upgrading is not that much more expensive and at least worth pricing out. And we always recommend the use of better finishes, coatings, especially in high-use areas. So better quality paints, possibly paints with a little bit of sheen to the finish in bathrooms and kitchens so that they're more cleanable. Thinking about finishes around cooking areas around the stove so that those areas are easier to clean. Those better finishes are also an option, something to think about. So let's specifically talk about insulation for a second here. There are lots of good insulation materials to consider. We're going to show you an illustration of fiber insulation in walls. That could be fiberglass, could be rock wool. You can also use cellulose insulation, which is recycled newspaper. That can be used in attics or in walls. Rigid foam boards sometimes are a good option, or spray foam, although spray foam is the most expensive option. Wall finishes, you could consider using paperless drywall in high-risk areas. This is drywall with a fiberglass mat on the surface rather than a paper surface, which obviously is going to be much less likely to grow mold in the future and more resilient, more resistant to moisture problems, but is quite a bit more expensive, but sometimes that's available locally after floods. And then flooring, you've got surface materials to consider in the future. You may have had carpet in the past. A flooding event may convince you that carpet isn't such a good thing anymore. A lot of people in flood-prone areas are getting way away from carpet use and going for other surfaces. And there are health reasons to avoid carpet. Carpet is very difficult to keep clean in the long run, even without a flood. Let's talk for a moment about air sealing. While you have the structure open, sealing up all the potential areas for air leaks is a really good idea. In both climates where you're subject to cold temperatures in the winter, or climates where you're subject to hot temperatures in the summer, or perhaps you're in a climate that does both. Air leaks waste energy dramatically. They tend to sometimes actually increase contaminant infiltration depending on where the air is coming from when it leaks out, the replacement air is coming from when it leaks out. More in cold climates, when we're heating air in the winter, that warm air tries to find a way to escape because it's lighter. It tries to go to the top of the building. If there are air leak spots at the ceiling, they'll go out. This is called the stack effect. And it's a dramatic effect, and this is an opportunity to do some air sealing. There's lots of reasons to consider air sealing. I think there are at least 7. Air leaks waste energy. They create drafts, which are a comfort issue. They actually make spaces less comfortable at the same indoor air temperature if it's drafty. And people sometimes will crank up the thermostat as a result and waste even more energy. Air sealing reduces the risk of fire spreading quickly. It's actually a building code requirement in new construction. It's a good thing to do in a gut rehab for fire-stopping reasons. Air leaks can transport moisture at high levels in some situations. Pests love to use those same pathways that air does to move around the house freely. Air leaks that are sealed help resist pest entry from the beginning, and this is called integrated pest management, or IPM. It's a great thing to do, and there's no chemicals involved in this. Air leaks also can carry other contaminants from garages, attics, crawl spaces into the living space, which we may not want. And it's a very inexpensive thing to do. It's just caulks and in some cases use of spray foam sometimes in small amounts to seal up gaps. Typical examples: plumbing chases, holes drilled for electrical cables, wall penetrations for electrical boxes, space around ductwork and flues. All of these are spots where we may want to do air sealing, and it can have a big impact on both energy usage and pest movement within a home. Here's a couple quick examples. This is a nozzle of a spray foam gun, placing a small amount of spray foam around a penetration in a crawl space or a basement where wires are going up through the ceiling. You can also see spray foam around the pipes in this photo. In this case, because it's a flue for a combustion appliance, you have to keep flammable materials away from it, so they're using sheet metal, just aluminum flashing here, to air seal around the flue at the attic level to resist air movement around in that space. Simple things to do, not that complex. Good things to consider. The insulation that we typically install in homes, think now moving to the concept of insulation, is bat insulation. Most folks are familiar with fiberglass bats. It takes more time or costs more to do well if you're hiring someone to do it, but installing bat insulation correctly is very important. It has a big impact on the effectiveness of the insulation. You can get a 40 to 60% improvement if it's done properly versus improperly. And that can be a little bit of a challenge to install around obstructions like wires, pipes, electrical boxes within wall cavities, but it's worth installing bat insulation well, taking the time to do it well. You can see spots in this wall, for instance, where they've just outright missed insulation. There's also places where there's gaps around electrical boxes. There's gaps between bats. If you want to get a little more information on this, a good Google search on properly installing bats will give you tons of good reference material. Insulating attics, this might be a good time to insulate your attic or increase the insulation in your attic. Cellulose is typically the least expensive way to go, although you can also blow fiberglass fibers into attics for insulation, and they both work very well as insulation materials. Cellulose is recycled product. It's relatively pest-proof because there are borates built into the insulation, into the cellulose. Jonathan spoke about borates before, relatively safe chemical, but also helps resist some pests. And it's fairly simple to do. It's fairly easy to find contractors to do it, and some people are capable of this as a DIY project. Spray foam is always an option. It is quite a bit more expensive, and this requires professional installation by trained people with a significant amount of personal protective equipment on, because the chemicals here are caustic while the foam is curing. Typically, this is beyond the budget. There are two types of spray foam I'll just mention very briefly. Open cell, which is less expensive, doesn't have as high an R value as closed cell. They're both good at noise reduction. They're both decent insulators, although the closed cell has a higher R value per inch, and closed cell is moisture impermeable. That has there are applications where that would be a better choice. I don't want to get into the weeds too much about that, but it is good to know the difference. Here's another example of spray foam insulation being installed in a wall cavity. Makes a very good insulation. Again, it can be quite a bit more expensive than some of the other options. Another option is to spray either cellulose or fiberglass into wall cavities rather than installing bats. They mix a little moisture into the fibers at the point they're spraying them in the wall, and they essentially stick into the wall, and then they brush brush the material flush with the face of the studs so that when you go back with a wall finish, there's no interference of the insulation. This does a very nice job. If this is available in your market, it's a great way to insulate because it fills all the little nooks and crannies evenly, does a superior job of insulating, and it means you don't necessarily have to handle fiberglass. There is also the possibility of blowing either cellulose or fiberglass into closed wall cavities, which you might care to do, even if there's areas of the house that haven't been affected, that you haven't gutted, because there was no water damage. You may still want to consider insulating those areas using one of these methods called dense packing. It can be blown in through holes in the exterior or the interior. There are different options. Windows and doors, sometimes it's absolutely necessary after a storm to replace them. Think about certainly getting Energy Star certified windows or doors if you're doing replacements. There are reasons to replace them, but the payback for replacing windows and doors from an energy perspective is not as great as you might think. Insulation and air sealing typically has a better return on investment from the dollar perspective. But sometimes if there's lead paint present, or maybe windows are just destroyed, or maybe you want windows that are easier to clean, there may be other reasons why you replace them. In any case, we would suggest considering Energy Star. Ductwork, I mentioned, replacing ductwork sometimes is necessary. Certainly, sealing the seams on ductwork is considered a very low cost and very effective thing to do. And during the rebuilding phase, if you're replacing ductwork, it's highly recommended now that you seal the seams. In metal ductwork, this photo of metal ductwork, you can see even the horizontal seams, and in addition to the seams between pieces of duct, are sealed by a gray mastic. It's like a toothpaste consistency, water-based mastic that you can just spray on with a stiff brush or by hand with a glove on. And it does do a great job of making sure the air, the conditioned air in the ductwork actually goes where it's supposed to go. And even the flexible ducts with vinyl liners and insulation on the outside, the connections between the flexible ducts and the metal boots that you'll often see, those joints should be sealed as well. So we always like to encourage people to think about making certain you're creating as healthy a living environment as possible. The National Center for Healthy Housing, Jonathan's organization, created this list of 8 principles. Started out with 7. Thermally controlled has been added over time. But it's a great way to think about and discuss the creation of healthy housing conditions. We want to keep homes dry, clean and cleanable, safe from tripping hazards, safe from electrical hazards, well lit, would fit under safe as well, well ventilated, contaminant free, not introducing contaminants, removing contaminants. Keeping homes pest free has great health benefits, and then keeping homes well maintained, which also means perhaps putting in materials that are a bit easier to maintain. And then, of course, thermally controlled, making sure we have comfortable living environments. These are the 8 principles that we would ask you to always think about. And especially controlling moisture, providing ventilation. We've talked about this a little bit earlier. Bathroom fans, kitchen fans, both of which are vented to the outside, are highly recommended today. Using integrated pest management to control pests, very important thing to do. Making sure if you're replacing heating, cooling, and air conditioning equipment that you're putting in equipment that's appropriately sized, not oversized, not undersized. that we're controlling hazards like carbon monoxide, lead paint, radon, using low VOC products, low formaldehyde materials. All of these things contribute to following those 8 principles. We really are strong on this idea of stormwater management, making sure that you are getting stormwater away from buildings as much as possible. Your house may not have good foundation drains, but if you can get gutters and downspouts operating well and make sure you have good grading around the foundation that moves water away from the building, that's a really excellent thing to do. And again, using good ventilation practices in bathrooms and kitchens. I'm not going to talk much about whole house ventilation, but in some cases, if you do a great job of insulating, that's something to consider. And an area that we have found lots of health hazards around is the area of improperly vented dryer ducts. Just a reminder, make sure that we vent dryers to the outside and use good quality ductwork. I want to just spend 3 or 4 slides before we end here talking about this concept of integrated pest management. Again, this is an opportunity to really seal up gaps and cracks that allow access by pests. I love this simple graphic. What we should be trying to do is reduce what we call the carrying capacity of buildings, the capacity of a building to support the life of the types of pests that we don't want in the house, those colonizing pests that come in and set up housekeeping, like certain insects like roaches, cockroaches, or rodents like mice. So if the carrying capacity of a building is up at that upper dotted line where there's a certain amount, the building provides enough food, water, and shelter. I sometimes use the term dating bars for comic relief here, areas where pests can congregate together freely. If the building supports this much life by providing enough food, water, and shelter, we can attack them with chemicals, but we'll only temporarily knock down the population. It will go back up. We can knock it down again with poisons, but it will go back up. What we really want to do is reduce access to food, water, and shelter and make the carrying capacity low, as is depicted in that lower red dotted line on the screen. And that's simple stuff. It's sealing up cracks with caulk or foam, possibly using borate powders like roach powders. This is an example of that in behind appliances. Sometimes using copper mesh to fill up bigger holes followed by caulk or foam so that rodents can't chew through spaces where the holes are big enough for them to get through. Rodents require very small spaces, and this copper mesh keeps them from crawling through. This stuff is easy to find online, and it's very affordable and does a great job. So you would use it in gaps before you sealed them up. That's what this is depicting. But sometimes just patching walls where there are holes in the plaster or drywall, or just filling in gaps around masonry between wall coverings. We like to use copper whenever it makes sense because it doesn't corrode and rust over time. In this case, because it's an interior surface, because it matches the color of the mortar, steel wool was used. And kind of in closing, this sealing up holes like this is a great thing to do. It's a simple thing, doesn't take a lot of skill. You can see this guy sealing up a penetration in a wall between an exterior air conditioning unit. Doesn't he look happy, fulfilled? He's using just gloves and a caulk gun. Simple stuff to do. And with that, here's a list of resources that will be in the download for you to look at. They'll be available later. You'll get an email with that information. All of these links should be quite useful. And I'm going to turn it back over to Laurie to wrap up now. And Lori.
Hi, everyone. Well, that was just extraordinary, Armand and Jonathan. Thank you so much for that incredible presentation. Every time I listen to this, I learn more, and what strikes me is something to point out is that some of these interventions, such as sealing up penetrations or cracks in a wall, not only will they help with mold abatement, but they'll also help with energy savings, as well as ventilation, and these all have direct returns for the residents of the homes, as well as the multifamily buildings. Donna, do we have, let's open up the forum to questions and discussions and comments about what we've just learned. So
okay.
Opening it up to the larger audience.
Excuse me. Just a reminder, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box, which is located on the lower right-hand side of your screen. I think folks were just trying to take in all that amazing amount of information. So we don't really have a lot of questions. I have one from someone who's dealing with a historic school building that's been vacant for 5 years. It's got broken windows that have allowed pigeons into the third floor level. And she asks if there are specific suggestions relative to remediation for that.
Jonathan, do you want to take that, or should I?
Why don't you get started?
Yeah, okay. So pigeons leave behind some of the most dangerous contaminants, and I'm sure we can all picture what I'm talking about when I say leave behind. This really is as dangerous as almost anything we'd find in a flood. So I would personally recommend having professionals deal with this. I would contact folks that are professionals in the pest removal industry, and I would try to get references from them for this specific type of work. Anything to add, Jonathan?
No, I agree. I mean, we're talking about diseases that I don't even know which is the proper respiratory provisions that you should have, what type of mask is best when fighting that. So I think that is the best approach, is to bring in somebody that can get fully suited up and address this problem.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's it so
Donna,
far.
I have a question that just came in directly to me, which is, what are the typical costs associated with sealing up exterior facilities? How do you estimate it? And then also, is there any funding support out there for helping affordable housing owners or operators or tenants remediate their home? That's a big question.
Two questions, actually, I would say.
Two questions.
In terms of sealing up, there are weatherization programs available to folks that are income eligible, that have highly trained professionals for doing air sealing and insulation work. So if you qualify for that, that would be what I would recommend you try to find out, who is running the local weatherization program. In terms of air sealing, that would be best. For other folks that have more means, there are professionals out there that are generally called home performance professionals that do insulation and insulation work. Again, highly trained folks. That is the line of professionals that focus on air sealing. Although there are many construction contractors that have good experience with this. And in terms of pricing that work out, It varies dramatically by the type of structure, the size of the structure, the size of the job. It is, I would say, fairly straightforward work. And one of the reasons we recommend it here is because it's much less expensive to do at the time you're doing significant rebuilding. So that's what I would say about that. In terms of resources, there eventually will be CDBG, disaster recovery, federal HUD funds for disaster recovery available in some of the affected areas. That takes a bit of time. FEMA does have some financial support to offer that tends to arrive quicker. And then there are local problems programs that may also fund some of this work. Sometimes local foundations get involved. But sadly, it often takes a while for the federal programs to get on the ground, making funding available.
The other thing I'd add is that, if you're in a situation where private insurance is kicking in, and we're talking about a restoration project, as Armand was saying, this is an opportunity point that sometimes for the same amount of money, sometimes for slightly more, you can create a healthier home during this restoration project. So if, for example, you need to put drywall back into a bathroom, and that you have a choice of putting back paper-faced drywall, or you can have a green board that is going to be water resistant. That may cost a little bit more, but your insurance company is going to be happier because you're not going to have problems with, if you had a leak in the future, that is going to be a better product and is going to keep their costs down in the future. So you do need to work with them, but there are opportunities at that point to restore your property and do it a little bit better.
Okay, Laura, we do have a few more questions that have come in. I see we're after time. Do you want to continue with more questions or close out?
Folks, do you want to do one more? Armand and Jonathan, have one more question, then we'll close out.
That's fine.
We're at your disposal.
Terrific. Donna, please.
Okay. Let's see. We have a question here. Last summer, we had a water main break that flooded under a child care center on site. Our maintenance staff went in the crawl space when it was safe to do so. It created a lot of mud. I'm receiving reports of mold smell. What should be just cut off, I apologize. I believe, what should be her first steps?
Yeah. Crawl spaces are infamous for adding moisture to the living environment, and there is a website that I would recommend taking a look at. It's called Crawl Spaces, that's plural, crawlspaces.org. There is a nonprofit firm in North Carolina that has done tons of research across the nation around crawl spaces. They're the crawl space geeks, and there's great information there. That's the quickest answer I can give. Certainly, at a minimum, I always recommend sealing the dirt. If there's a dirt floor exposed in a crawl space, sealing that from the air in the crawl space with a continuous plastic vapor barrier, and sealing that vapor barrier to the walls of the foundation to at a minimum, keep the moisture from the ground from coming up into the crawl space.
And I think the questioner added a really important point, which is if you can smell it, you have a problem.
Yeah.
There are many people that are out there recommending that you do mold species testing, and we really don't have a standard for mold. We don't have a standard for any type of mold, and there isn't knowledge on which molds are safe, which molds are not safe. So you'll get this report back, and at the end of the day, your response will be exactly the same. If you know that you have a series of 20 molds or 40 molds, you're going to have to clean it out. So if you smell it, take the steps to figure out where the moisture source is and where the mold is growing, and then dry it out and clean it out. And that's the important step. Investing in the testing is really just diverting money that you can be using for your remediation.
Jonathan, you make a really superb point there. Dealing with these problems, especially ongoing moisture problems, if we're only dealing with the mold, we're dealing with a symptom in a way. We really need to get at the source of the moisture in all cases to deal with it. And I wholeheartedly agree about it doesn't really, the fact that it doesn't really matter what kind of mold you have. It's important to deal with all of it.
Great, thank you. And we have one last question. Would you recommend application of wall or floor treatments prior to dry out, or full dry out with treatments after, or before and after?
Oh, that's a great question, isn't it? It does seem kind of screwy to dry it out and then spray something on it, but that is the best strategy to get the wood components that you're going to spray in particular down to a relatively dry condition before you add any coatings. And for some of the coatings, like the borate powders, they will absorb in quickly and will not take much time to dry out. You're not really saturating the chemicals. Some of the other chemicals may take a little bit longer to dry. The coatings are the ones that would slow down the process the most, but they're also the ones that require the driest conditions because they have to form a mechanical bond with the surface. Jonathan, do you have anything you want to say about that?
I would just add that somebody relayed to us recently that, again, read the manufacturer's instructions. There are a few of these products that bone dry is actually not optimal. You want some moisture in the wood, and in most flood cleanup places, that's not the problem you're dealing with. But if it has dried out for a while, then they actually tell you to wet the surface a little bit before you apply, because it aids in the capillary action. It adds and aids in drawing that into the wood, and that's what you want to do, is to draw it in so it gets a little bit deeper and is going to fight off the growth of that mold. So, again, read the instructions, make sure you're following those instructions.
Yeah, that's good. Good advice.
And that was our last question. Lori?
That's great. I can't thank you all enough. Donna, thank you so much for emceeing, and Armand, thank you for your training, and Jonathan, of course, thank you for your expertise and your training. We're going to be sending around the slides today as well as information about this work. Be on the lookout for a new revised version of the mold guide. Jonathan's working on that, and it's going to be a really exciting set of new guidance and tips to share with you. You got a lot of the heads up today on this preview webinar. Please stay in touch with us. Reach out to Enterprise directly should you have any questions, as well as any thoughts or programmatic needs, and we'd certainly be happy to support you in whatever way we can and are capable of. I want to wish you all a very good luck in your work to fortify your homes and make sure that they're safe and habitable for the folks that you serve. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to staying in touch.